treason, absolute treason against the American people and against our military. Everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States.
Hey friends, thanks so much for tuning in. It's great to have you back. It really truly is. And it's great to have back our good friend and author James Perloff, jamesperloff.com. Look guys, the anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor is December 7th, of course. And just like almost every other war we've ever been involved with, there's more to this story. And was it necessary at all? James Perloff is going to help us break it down. James, how are you?
I'm doing good, especially being back here on the friendly turf of SGT Report.
It's a thrill to have you back, my friend, and I would like to call attention to one of the most successful, widely shared, most watched interviews I've ever done. It was with you. It's called The Elite Don't Want You to Know God is Real. And he really is, folks. The elite don't want you to know that. They would prefer that you just believe in the Big Bang theory. That's what it is. And the fact that, we're all here just by accident, James. That's what they want us to believe, right? If they can get people to believe that this whole thing is an accident and your life doesn't really matter, then folks are probably more likely to practice that Aleister Crowley do as thou wiltst approach to life, which isn't good for anybody, and it's particularly not good for your own soul.
Well, that was the main idea behind Darwinism, to take away God as creator, take away God, you take away the Bible, you take away the Ten Commandments, and then you've got people doing the kind of things that they want us to do.
Well, James, one of the reasons we're doing this interview is, of course, because the 76th anniversary of Pearl Harbor is barreling down on us. And, for our younger viewers, well, boy, for many of our viewers, I'm not an expert on World War II or Pearl Harbor. I think it's important to set the stage and explain the history because, as you've said so many times, it's through the proper lens of history that we can only understand what we're dealing with today. So why don't you give us a broad overview here of what we're going to talk about, and then we'll dive right in.
Well, first I want to just define what this attack was. It, of course, was the event that brought us into World War II. It was an attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet, which was stationed in Hawaii by Japanese airplanes launched from aircraft carriers, and they sank or heavily damaged 18 U.S. warships, left over 2,000 Americans dead. And this was the event that led to the last declaration of war we ever had. It brought us into that war. But what we'll be talking about mostly today is the backstory of Pearl Harbor. And what I'd like to go over today is the fact that, number one, this attack was provoked. Number two, that the fleet was set up in Pearl Harbor against all naval advice. Number three, that the attack was fully foreknown by people at the highest levels in Washington, information that they did not share with our military commanders in Hawaii who were surprised. And finally, the cover-up, which inevitably had to take place after this disastrous event was orchestrated.
Okay. Now, I'm looking at Wikipedia here about Franklin Roosevelt, and it says, on the day in 1941, when Pearl Harbor occurred at around 1:30 p.m., President Franklin Roosevelt is conferring with advisor Harry Hopkins in his study when Navy Secretary Frank Knox bursts in and announces that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. And I had forgotten this part. The attack killed more than 2,400 naval and military personnel. I forgot the number. Almost as many as were killed on 9/11, which, by the way, was a false flag, folks. We've talked about that at length. So I think that sets the stage. Why don't you take it from there? How was Japan provoked into this attack?
First, Sean, I think I should also just let people know that I've been studying Pearl Harbor for a long, long time. And this is actually a article I wrote, a 12-page article, first page of it, in 1986 for the New American on Pearl Harbor. And wrote another cover story for them in 2001 that was really in response to the Ben Affleck Pearl Harbor movie. And if you go to my website, jamesperloff.com, you'll see an extensive post on Pearl Harbor. It is, in fact, called Pearl Harbor Roosevelt's 9/11. And you'll see documentation there. But I do want to let people know this is not just some offbeat theory that somebody in the truth movement recently came up with. Just to walk you through some history here, this book, Pearl Harbor by George Morgenstern, who wrote for he was a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, revealed a lot of the things we'll be talking about today. That's not the original cover, but it was published in 1947. Then in 1954, you had The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor on the day of the attack, commanding destroyers. Then in 1955, our Pacific Fleet commander, husband Kimmel, published Admiral Kimmel's story, further affirming these things. Other books came out in the interim, and then a real groundbreaker was this one, John Toland's book, Infamy, Pearl Harbor and its Aftermath. I consider it the best single volume. And of course, Toland was a Pulitzer Prize winner, although not for that particular book. Then in 1988, the BBC had a documentary called Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor, which affirms the things that we're saying today. And you can watch that on YouTube. I linked to it from my article. I've embedded there. And then in 2000, this book came out, Day of Deceit, The Truth About FDR and Pearl Harbor by Robert Stinnett. And Stinnett used the Freedom of Information Act to cover new information. Sean, the reason these books kept coming out, this is a book from 2007, The Pearl Harbor Myth. The reason new books keep coming out is not to just rehash the story, but because new revelations come forward, new eyewitnesses have come forward over the years, though most of at this point have passed away. So there is a lot of documentation to this. And before we talk about the backstory of Pearl Harbor, I think it's also important to mention the motivations that what we call the powers that be had for getting us into the Second World War. We'll just be real quick with it, but they are very, it was not to stop Germany and Japan from conquering the world. No document has ever been found in any German archive indicating that Germany had a plan to conquer the world. Nor was such a goal ever expressed by Hitler or any of his generals or politicians publicly or privately. And I've gone, if you ever have a chance to watch my interview with Tim Kelly on Our Interesting Times, we go into World War II extensively for almost 3 hours. We're not going to do that today, but neither did Japan want to conquer the world. Japan's smaller than the state of Montana. They're not going to conquer the world. But that was the public reason being given why we had to be involved with this war. And of course, the flashpoint was Pearl Harbor. But the reasons why the powers that be wanted to get us into the Second World War were actually in continuity from their motives for getting us into the First World War. Number one, world government. Okay, so World War I created the League of Nations. World War II gave us the UN, which we still have with us. World banking, right? World War I was bankrolled by the just created Federal Reserve, and then World War II created the World Bank and the IMF. Then in terms of communism, communism was birthed in the world. The first communist state was created, the Soviet Union, 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, of course, and then World War II was used to spread it over half the globe into Asia and into Eastern Europe. And then, of course, you have Zionism with the 1917 Balfour Declaration, setting up the state of Israel, which would then be created by World War II. And then you can also, there's war profiteering, suppression of civil liberties at home. There's a whole multi-dimensional number of motives for this war, as far as the oligarchs go, the oligarchs that run our government and other governments from behind the scenes. So that's kind of their motive versus the public motive that they're giving us. But let's move into the main focus of discussion, which is Pearl Harbor itself.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
It's one of these things that we won't hit on if I don't ask it. And I don't want to take us off course here, right? Because I know you've prepared a nice presentation, so we'll let you roll. But I don't think that the real story has ever been told about Hitler, because there's been a release of some new CIA documents which suggest that he did escape and did not die in a bunker after World War II, and he escaped to South America. So not that we're going to go off on that topic, but do you think there was a Zionist connection to Hitler?
No, I know that that's one of the most hotly debated issues in alt media. I think it's a red herring. I think that revisionist historians began to uncover the truth about World War II as far as Pearl Harbor went, as far as Japan and Germany, their motives, and also as far as the depiction of the Holocaust. And as revisionists moved in on that, I believe that the idea that Hitler was a British or Rothschild agent was thrown into the mix to distract us. I can't say with 100% certainty, just like on a jury. You look at the preponderance of evidence. But I think that story is a red herring. I don't believe it. And we could go into that, and I could cite references against it. But I want to kind of stay on track with Pearl Harbor. But just that's my opinion on that. I do not believe he was working for the other side at all.
Okay, so getting back to what fostered this attack at Pearl Harbor, I know the U.S. was waging economic warfare against the Japanese for some time. So take it away.
Okay, so the provocation of the attack. First, I want to back this up with some quotations, okay? The British historian Russell Grenfell, who'd been a captain in the Royal Navy, wrote this in his 1952 book, Main Fleet to Singapore, quote, "No reasonably informed person can now believe that Japan made a villainous, unexpected attack on the United States. An attack was not only fully expected, but was actually desired. It is beyond doubt that President Roosevelt wanted to get his country into war, but for political reasons was most anxious to ensure that the first act of hostility came from the other side, for which reason he caused increasing pressure to be put on the Japanese to a point that no self-respecting nation could endure without resort to arms. Japan was meant by the American president to attack the United States," unquote. And I'll give you another one from Oliver Littleton, who was Britain's Minister of Production. And here's what he said to the American Chamber of Congress in London on June the 20th, 1944, quote, "America provoked Japan to such an extent that the Japanese were forced to attack Pearl Harbor. It is a travesty on history ever to say that America was forced into the war," unquote. And you'll find those citations in my online article at jamesperloff.com called Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11. Now, let's just give a little backdrop here. Americans did not want to get into World War II. They'd already learned to some extent about the Lusitania and how they've been ripped off by industrialists for billions of dollars for war materials that never been delivered. They didn't want to fight in World War II. And so the powers that be knew that they were going to have to create a provocation. Now, when the Lusitania went down, the sinking of the Lusitania was the main event that propelled us into World War I. There was a British passenger ship with Americans on board, actually carrying tons and tons of munitions. That's where a German U-boat sank it. But that was what propelled us into World War I. And at that time, the American Assistant Naval Secretary was Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the head of the British Admiralty was Winston Churchill. And so that sets up some red flags as we look at World War II. As it approaches, we now see these two men are heads of state. And they initially were looking to get another Lusitania, and they attempted to provoke the Germans into another Lusitania. And what we were doing was, we were giving lend-lease to the British, and we would accompany their convoys with our destroyers. And our destroyers were actually chasing and depth charging their U-boats. But the Germans were not retaliating because they did not want to draw us into the war. They knew that America coming to World War I had cost them that war. And I'll give you a quote. This is from Admiral Dönitz at Nuremberg. He had, of course, had been the commander of U-boat forces for the Germans. Quote, "A 300-mile safety zone was granted to America by Germany when international law called only for a 3-mile zone. I suggested minefields at Halifax and around Iceland, but the Fuhrer rejected this because he wanted to avoid conflict with the United States. When American destroyers in the summer of 1941 were ordered to attack German submarines, I was forbidden to fight back. I was thus forced not to attack British destroyers for fear there would be some mistake," unquote. So it's very obvious to the Germans that they could not get into a conflict with America. And it soon became obvious to Churchill and Roosevelt that they were not going to get anywhere trying to provoke the Germans. And they decided, we need more than a Lusitania this time around, with the American public being over 80% getting involved with this war. We need a whole slew of Lusitanias, but we're not going to get it from Germany. So the focus changed to Japan. So in 1941, Harold Ickes, who was our Interior Secretary, wrote this to Roosevelt. He said, quote, "Our best entrance into the war would be by way of Japan." So they started holding meetings, cabinet meetings, in that autumn. We're talking about autumn of 1941. The Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, member of the CFR, member of Skull and Bones, wrote this in his diary. Quote, this is after meeting with the president. "We face the delicate question of the diplomatic fencing to be done so as to be sure Japan is put into the wrong and makes the first bad move, overt move. The question was how we should maneuver them, meaning the Japanese, into the position of firing the first shot, unquote. Henry Stimson. And Lieutenant Commander Arthur McCollum of Naval Intelligence prepared a plan for the president. It was an 8-step plan of provocations towards Japan, and it closed with these words, quote, if by these means Japan could be led to commit an overt act of war, so much the better. And that was the plan. Now, the culmination of this, this 8-step plan was an all-out trade embargo against the Japanese. And so that was enacted. Now, you have to bear in mind that Japan was very dependent on imports for 88% of its oil, 75% of its food, and many natural resources. And this all-out embargo, which was not coincidentally enacted 1 month after Operation Barbarossa, the six-nation European invasion of the Soviet Union by not only Germany, but Finland, Italy, Romania, Hungary, and Croatia. There were people in high places who were most eager to make sure that Japan did not join in Operation Barbarossa from the east, as some Japanese politicians wanted to do. The trade embargo prevented that from happening. No modern nation can function without oil. So what was the public justification for this trade embargo? Well, the public justification given by Roosevelt was, well, Japan's an international aggressor, and we have to punish them because they're an international aggressor. They want to conquer the world. Well, what was the evidence that Japan wanted to conquer the world? Well, they had their troops in China, okay? And they also had some troops in Indochina, but that was by the invitation of the Vichy government, so it wasn't really an invasion. They had troops in China, and it was said we have to punish them for this international aggression. But here's what nobody ever mentioned, Sean. The Japanese troops didn't set foot in China until the Soviet Union first attacked and took over Outer Mongolia and the Chinese northwestern province of Xinjiang. And that's when they moved in with their troops, because they saw the Soviet Union. If you look at the map, Japan is across from both Russia and China. Russia had already become all communist. Now communism was coming down into China. And I want to back this up with a quote from Dr. Anthony Kubik, who was chairman of the political science department at the University of Dallas. Here's what he wrote in his book, How the Far East Was Lost. Quote, it was apparent to Japanese statesmen that unless bastions of defense were built in Manchuria and Inner Mongolia, communism would spread through all of North China and seriously threaten the security of Japan. But the Department of State seemed not to regard Japan as a bulwark against Soviet expansion in China. As a matter of fact, not one word of protest was sent by the State Department to the Soviet Union, despite her absorption of Xinjiang and Outer Mongolia, while at the same time Japan was censured for stationing troops in China, unquote. You see, Sean, the Japanese knew that if they didn't stop the expansion of communism, it would engulf Asia. They were right. This is exactly what happened. After we defeated Japan, by 1949, China was communist, and we had to fight the communists in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And if we'd left them alone to hold off communism, that never would have happened.
Well, James, you've taken us through so much already. Let's just recap for the audience why the powers that be were foaming at the mouth to get us into World War II and to let Pearl Harbor happen. I know you already talked about Operation Barbarossa, but so much more came out of World War II. Just recap. Why did they want to get us into this quagmire?
Well, actually, we've kind of covered this, Sean, and involved establishment of the UN, establishment of the World Bank and IMF, war profiteering, creation of the Zionist state of Israel, which is to be the capital of this world government that they're ultimately planning, which they may need a third world war to get, suppression of civil liberties at home, and again, keeping Japan out of Operation Barbarossa, because, you know, the banksters in New York had created the Soviet Union. It was their creation. You go back to, you know, research about Jacob Schiff and the Warburgs and sending Lenin in a train filled with gold, and Trotsky being sent from New York City by Jacob Schiff with 20 million in gold. And this was their investment. They were protecting it. And there was some desperation in the upper ranks when Operation Barbarossa started. And that was one of the immediate incentives for the embargo one month later. But again, for all those multi-dimensional reasons we gave at the start of the broadcast, that's why they're trying to get into the wars, to advance the world government Zionist agenda.
Well, I just think it needs to be said because it always does come back to the world government Zionist agenda. Every single time, right? Just like on 9/11. You know, they wanted to spark these wars in the Middle East that Americans would not otherwise get behind. So what did they do? They devised a plan to get us behind unconstitutional wars of aggression that are going on to this day. And now, of course, we see the opium epidemic exploding in this nation as our military troops guard the poppy fields in Afghanistan, where the opium production is now at an all-time high, whereas under the Taliban it was at an all-time low. So we have the drug running, with the unconstitutional wars without end, the war profiteering. Boy, this is a tired old playbook, James. All right, so let's get back here to World War II and focus on this. The attack from the Japanese could not have been a total surprise if we had any surveillance whatsoever, because a lot of people probably don't realize Japan is not right next to Hawaii. It's 4,108 miles away. So how in the world did this sneak attack happen, James, and why were our battleships just left there as sitting ducks for the Japanese warplanes to hit?
Okay. I'm going to talk about the setting up of the fleet. Before I do, though, I want to just mention that the act on America's part that triggered, that was the immediate trigger for the attack, was an ultimatum we gave the Japanese. Now, the Japanese were earnestly negotiating to end this trade embargo because strangling them. So, but they offered to do this. They said, look, we'll pull all our troops back into, you think we're international aggressors, we'll pull all our troops back into Japan. We'll take them out of South China, Indochina, but we have to maintain a foothold in North China, right across the Sea of Japan, because we can't let communism destroy us. We have to have some presence there. It was their version of the Monroe Doctrine. They did not want communism taking over in Asia. Well, we sent them an ultimatum. It's called the Whole Ultimatum. But we now know, and this is, I linked to this, acknowledged by Time magazine. The Whole Ultimatum was actually written by Harry Dexter White, who was a Zionist communist agent. He actually was a Soviet spy. And that was acknowledged, by the way, that he was a Soviet spy, even by Eisenhower's attorney general. So actually, Time magazine's article was not breaking news exactly, but he wrote the ultimatum said this: no, you must bring every Japanese soldier back into the mainland of Japan. Imagine if somebody told that to us in America, how we'd react to it. Well, the Japanese realized this was a catch-22. We were strangling them economically with this. It was actually a three-nation embargo. It's not only us, but it's the Dutch and the British. They were being strangled economically. They couldn't function. And we're told the only way to end the embargo is to let communism sweep into Asia. You take your troops out of China. So to the Japanese, this was, again, it's death. It's a two-headed coin. It's death either way. Either we die by economic strangulation or we die from communism. So they said, we're going to fight. And that was the trigger point. That was November 26th, less than 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor. Okay, let's talk about why the fleet was in Pearl Harbor. Ask somebody, why was the American fleet in Pearl Harbor? And most people can't answer that question. Now, normally the fleet was berthed in around San Diego on our west coast. So who made that decision? It was Franklin D. Roosevelt, our president. He said he wanted to indefinitely move the fleet from the west coast of the United States to Hawaii. Now, when the fleet commander, Admiral J.O. Richardson, heard this, he went into a rage, and he went to the president on October the 8th, 1940, and he was very angry, and he gave him a litany of reasons as to why the fleet should not be in Pearl Harbor. Let's go over those reasons, Sean. Number one, Pearl Harbor is in the middle of the ocean, so you can surprise attack it from 360 degrees, whereas if you kept the fleet on the west coast, no way to surprise attack it. Any attackers are going to run into commercial shipping, airplanes, etc. Number two, the fleet was boxed in like sardines. I sent you a map of this. You had to put battleships right next to each other. So if a bomber missed one ship, he'd probably hit the ship next to it, okay? It was a death trap in Pearl Harbor. Number three, you had to resupply the fleet over 2,000 miles of Pacific to bring oil, replacement parts, new personnel, 2,000 miles. If you want to keep the fleet on a war footing, keep it on the West Coast. Number four, Pearl Harbor had very limited oil storage, dry docks for repairs, tugs, etc. You needed to maintain a fleet. Number five, if you're worried about a conflict with the Japanese, Hawaii was 37% ethnically Japanese, just setting yourself up for espionage and sabotage. Number six, putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor separated all the sailors from their families, which was very bad for morale. And in response to this, President Roosevelt told Admiral J.O. Richardson he had one reason for putting the fleet in Pearl Harbor. He said it will deter Japanese aggression. Well, was he right about that, Sean? As of December the 7th, 1941, he was dead wrong. It did not deter Japanese aggression. They attacked the fleet there. But mainstream historians have never held Roosevelt accountable for his decision against naval advice to put the fleet there. It was his decision. Instead, as we're going to see today, mainstream media historians have always faulted the Navy. They were scapegoated for this attack when Roosevelt not only knew about the attack, but he put the fleet in there as a sitting duck, because to get the Japanese to attack us, you had to give them some. We're a big country; they're a small country. You had to give them an edge, and the edge we gave them was putting the fleet there as sitting ducks, waiting to be attacked.
Well, that certainly sounds like an act of treachery, does it not? Is that what it was?
Treason, absolute treason against the American people and against our military.
Yeah. Why do you suppose he was never held to account for that? Is it because the mainstream media is just bought and paid for, just as it is today? I mean, they gave Bush and Cheney a free pass for 9/11, right? Same exact thing. The hard questions are never asked, and the people who should be fired at the Pentagon, wherever, they get promoted.
Right. The mainstream media and, of course, the highest levels of government itself being under the same control. That's why Roosevelt was never held accountable. We'll be talking about the cover-up momentarily. But the next thing we could move into, or I should mention that Admiral Richardson, after this confrontation with the president, was fired as fleet commander. He was replaced by Husband Kimmel. Admiral Husband Kimmel was the fleet commander, Pacific Fleet commander at the time of Pearl Harbor. He and the Army general there, General Walter C. Short, were scapegoated for the attack. Their families have been fighting for decades to clear their names, because they know the truth. Okay, they know the truth about the attack. But let's talk about the foreknowledge of the attack. And I showed you some books at the beginning, going back to George Morgenstern's 1947 book on Pearl Harbor. But it was known within the Army and Navy that this attack was foreknown. In 1944, the Naval Court of Inquiry and Army Pearl Harbor Board investigated Pearl Harbor. And here's what the Army Pearl Harbor Board, the sentence that sums up their report, quote, "Up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States," unquote. That's according to the official U.S. Army investigation, which you can find online. As we're going to see, Roosevelt suppressed this report. All right, it did not become public knowledge, at least in the way that it should have been. But the attack was foreknown. How did they know the attack was coming? There were actually four ways, but I'll give you the three most important ones. First of all was the Purple Code. Now, this was the code that Japan used for its diplomatic messages. You know, a country always enciphers its messages. And the Purple Code was the code Japan used to communicate to its embassies and consulates. And the Japanese had a machine that would encipher this code and decipher the code. And they thought it was unbreakable, but actually some very talented American cryptanalysts broke the code. And as a result, in 1941, we devised our own machines. So we were able to put the code into our own machines, and we're reading their diplomatic messages on a same-day basis. But the commanders in Hawaii did not have access to this. But the messages were sent, the deciphered intercepts were sent on a regular basis to President Roosevelt in a locked pouch, along with certain key top advisors. And they also went to Harry Hopkins, who've already mentioned. Harry Hopkins was a front man for Bernard Baruch. And Alwyn Kramer, who was in the Navy's translation department, testified that he brought these messages to Harry Hopkins in his hotel room. We can be sure that if Harry Hopkins was getting them in his hotel room, then the man he worked for, Bernard Baruch, was reading these top secret diplomatic messages, which even our military commanders, were not allowed to see in Hawaii. Well, what did these messages reveal? Well, they revealed that Japan, Tokyo, had ordered its spies in Hawaii to relate to spy upon the American fleet and to convey to Tokyo the exact locations of every ship and dock. Now, there's nothing unusual about a spy watching for ship movements. But when an enemy nation wants to know the precise location of each ship and dock, the obvious implication is that the fleet has been targeted for attack. But of course, Washington decided that this was not important for Hawaiian commanders to know about. The discoded intercepts also revealed that Japan had told Germany that war is about to break out. We actually had translated Japan's declaration of war before they gave it to us. 13 parts of the 14-part message had already been translated, now and intercepted. Now, if you ever watched the Hollywood movie Tora, 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 in that movie, the Japanese ambassadors give their declaration of war to Secretary of State Cordell Hull in the movie, right, after the attack, and he's shock and awe, a total surprise, we're at war, I can't believe it. Well, in real life, he'd already read the Declaration of War. He wasn't even remotely surprised by what they were handing him. He knew all about it. But in addition to the decoded intercepts, there were many personal warnings that were given to Washington. For example, our ambassador to Japan sent this message to Washington in 1941, quote, this is from Joseph Grew, our ambassador, quote, the Peruvian minister has informed a member of my staff that he's heard from many sources that in the event of trouble breaking out between the United States and Japan, the Japanese intend to make a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor with all their strength. Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe was our military advisor in Java. The island of Java was under the control of the Dutch. The Dutch also learned of the attack on Pearl Harbor, and they advised Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe, who you can see interviewed in the BBC documentary I mentioned, Sacrifice of Pearl Harbor. He says he sent a total of 4 warnings about Pearl Harbor to Washington, and finally the War Department said, send us no further warnings related to Pearl Harbor. The Dutch also had their military attaché in Washington, FGL Weiserman, informed General Marshall, our chief of staff, of the forthcoming attack. J. Edgar Hoover, director of the FBI, warned President Roosevelt of the attack based on information he got from a Yugoslavian double agent named Dusko Popov. You can see Popov interviewed in that BBC documentary. President Roosevelt was warned about the attack by Senator Guy Gillette, who was warned of it by the Korean underground. According to Gillette, Roosevelt told him to just keep this to yourself. I'm next going to quote U.S. Congressman Martin Dies of Texas. He received a map of the detailing the Japanese plan to attack Pearl Harbor, and here's what he wrote. Quote, U.S. Congressman Martin Dies, quote, as soon as I received the document, I telephoned Secretary of State Cordell Hull and told him what I had. Secretary Hull directed me not to let anyone know about the map. Instead, they would call me as soon as he had talked to President Roosevelt. In about an hour, he telephoned to say that he talked to Roosevelt, and they agreed that it would be very serious if any information concerning this map reached the news services. I told him it was a grave responsibility to withhold such vital information from the public. The Secretary assured me that he and Roosevelt considered it essential to national defense, unquote, Congressman Martin Dies. Sean, that is a sampling of the personal warnings that Roosevelt and Chief of Staff Marshall received, but I'll pause here. There's one more I need to go into.
Well, let me tell you this. Many of us who are familiar with what happened on 9/11 are also familiar with the document from Project for a New American Century, in which they call for the need for a new Pearl Harbor. I don't think that those words have ever meant as much now as they mean, knowing how clearly what happened in Pearl Harbor was a total setup, just like 9/11 was a total setup. It's treason any way you cut it.
It is treason, and I should mention that it's not a coincidence either that the movie Pearl Harbor came out midway between PNAC calling for New Pearl Harbor and 9/11 itself. It came out in May of 2001. And by the way, Touchstone Pictures, which made the movie Pearl Harbor with Ben Affleck, I don't believe they, from what I've seen, they've never made a war movie before that. Was anyone looking for a movie about Pearl Harbor in 2001? They were looking for it because they wanted to get the public geared up. But let me get on to the final means by which they knew about the attack. And this did not become known until this book came out by Robert Stinnett. Stinnett used the Freedom of Information Act, and he found something new using the FOIA. He discovered that we had not only cracked Japan's diplomatic codes, but we cracked their naval codes. So as the Japanese fleet was approaching Pearl Harbor. They did not maintain complete silence. They maintained discretion, but they sent messages, and we're reading their naval messages as well. And here's one that would unquestionably be significant. This is from Admiral Yamamoto to the Japanese First Air Fleet, November the 25th, 1941. Quote, "The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day, exact date to be given by later order," unquote. Sean, no one can read that intercept and not know what it means, but this was not passed on to our commanders at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, and again, I'll just expand on what I just said about a new Pearl Harbor. What happened at Pearl Harbor was a catastrophic and catalyzing event that was used to get the American people to send their sons to war, World War II. How much blood do these people have on their hands? Really? How much? Millions and millions of people in these wars. And that's not to even talk about the other wars they got us into on the back of false flags. The blood on these hands of these people, they're truly monsters. But go ahead.
Yeah, it's demonic. And by the way, if you actually look at the post Pearl Harbor posters, you see it's just like the ones after 9/11. Remember Pearl Harbor, these colors don't run. The exact same phraseology being used. But let's talk now about the cover-up. There's a cover-up for 9/11, especially the 9/11 Commission. But as you can imagine, after Pearl Harbor, there were cries of, how did this happen to us? Why were we caught by surprise? Why were we caught off guard? Why did so many Americans have to die? There was a call for accountability. So President Roosevelt appointed a commission to investigate what had happened on Pearl Harbor, even though he knew full well. It was called the Roberts Commission. It was run by a Supreme Court Justice, Owen Roberts, who was very friendly with Roosevelt. And the two Army officers were close to the Chief of Staff, George Marshall, who was deeply involved with the Pearl Harbor event. One of the admirals was a retired Admiral Joseph Reeves. He'd been given a job in Lend-Lease by Roosevelt. So this is a very Washington-friendly group. So the Roberts Commission spent a couple of days in Washington, all very chummy, even taking unsworn testimony. Then they moved out to Hawaii, where they conducted 3 weeks of investigation. And Admiral Kimmel and General Short were shocked to find they were denied the right to legal counsel. They were not allowed the right to ask questions. And when they say, why aren't we allowed to have legal representation here? Justice Roberts said, well, this is not a courtroom. It's just an informal hearing. Well, they subsequently found that some significant testimony was left out of the Roberts Commission report, which in its findings stated that Washington had executed its duties in an exemplary manner. Roosevelt, Marshall, and all the rest. And all the blame for Pearl Harbor, according to the Roberts Commission, lay with the commanders there, Admiral Kimmel and General Short. They accused them of dereliction of duty, said they had not taken adequate surveillance of the waters surrounding Pearl Harbor. Well, they'd been begging, Sean, for patrol planes. They're very short of patrol planes. Hundreds of patrol planes were being rolled out. They're being sent to the Soviet Union and Britain, not to Hawaii. And but they were blamed. And Roosevelt read the report, tossed it to his secretary, and said, give that to the newspapers for their evening edition. So the headlines in American newspapers across the country was dereliction of duty. People were screaming for the blood of these two officers. Members of Congress said they should be shot and or at least be court-martialed. And Kimmel and Short, Sean, they did something that almost no military officer ever asked. They said, yes, we want to be court-martialed. Please let there be a court-martial, because they wanted the matter of Pearl Harbor to be resolved in a real courtroom where normal evidence procedures would be followed, which had not been the case with the Roberts Commission.
Yeah, they would have had discovery. If they could have an actual court-martial, they would have had the privilege of discovery, in which all of this information could have been shared on the public record. Of course, the government didn't want that.
Right. President Roosevelt forbade the court-martial, saying that it was a time of national security. We're at war now. We can't get further into this matter. So there was no court-martial until 1944. Now, in 1944, it was mandated by Congress, because at this point, we were clearly winning the war. national security could no longer be used as a pretext for not having these trials. So in 1944, the Naval Court of Inquiry convened along with the Army Pearl Harbor Board. And Kimmel and Short were on trial, and their friends, they had friends in the Navy Department, of course, who had tipped them off about the decoded intercepts, that Washington had full foreknowledge of the attack. Now, when the admirals on the Naval Court of Inquiry heard these intercepts being read, Sean, they threw their pencils on the floor. Admiral Kimmel was completely exonerated, and all blame for Pearl Harbor was laid by them on Washington. Army Pearl Harbor Board, I've already given you the quote that they concluded with, up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States, unquote. Now, Roosevelt knew that if the results of these trials became public, he was done politically. It would be a scandal. So once again, he said, in the interest of national security, we cannot allow these reports to be public knowledge. So he said, until national security permits it, we cannot allow the verdicts to be known to the public. So in the meantime, while they were on ice, the verdicts were on ice and the public didn't know about it, Roosevelt had new supplementary investigations conducted. Now, the people chosen for this, to conduct these supplementary investigations, were Lieutenant Colonel Henry Clausen, a fellow Freemason, and Lieutenant Commander John F. Sonnet. Now, these men would end up overturning the results of these formal inquiries, and this was unprecedented for a lieutenant colonel to overturn a verdict rendered by generals, and for a lieutenant commander to overturn a verdict rendered by admirals. But what happened, Sean, the way they got away with it, was they went around to the various officers who had testified about Washington's foreknowledge to the Army Pearl Harbor Board and the Naval Court of Inquiry. I'll give you an example. Colonel Rufus Bratton of Army Intelligence had testified before the Army Pearl Harbor Board that on December the 6th, the day before the attack, he had delivered the intercept of Japan's declaration of war to General Marshall's office. Now, after the new supplementary investigation has begun, Lieutenant Colonel Clausen flags down Bratton on a highway, and he hands him statements from Marshall's secretary and another general in Marshall's department, denying that these deliveries were ever made of Japan's declaration of war. So you're Rufus Bratton, you're a colonel, so what do? It's your word against the Army Chief of Staff. Your career is on the line. He's handed papers. He signs a new document. I'm sorry, I was mistaken when I said I delivered that declaration of war. My memory must have slipped. And this happened with officer after officer. They were coerced into changing their testimony. Now I want to mention that not every officer gave in. For example, Captain Lawrence Safford, who was in charge of the cryptography department of the Navy, refused to give in. He continued, and for the rest of his life, he's devoted much of it to proving and demonstrating that we knew about the attack in advance. But most of the officers gave in. So the government waited until the day American troops arrived in Japan to announce the results of these trials, right? And everybody celebrated America. Nobody really cares. The war is over that day, right? So Americans are celebrating. And if they noticed, there was a little headline that the trial results had been the trials had found fault with Washington, but further investigation had discredited those original findings. So nobody actually found out what happened, unless you read the 40-volume report put out by the U.S. government printing office. You could read the results for yourself. Or over the years, the truth came out as officers and authors like John Toland came out and reported the truth to the public. But the public did not find out what had actually been determined by those trials based on the real evidence.
Well, I'm learning something new here, and I think that was the reason for this conversation, James. So I really appreciate it because, look, I didn't know about Captain Lawrence Safford, who now that I know he was not willing to cave and he was going to tell the truth, reminds me of General Smedley Butler, the most decorated Marine ever, who would not cave and would not play along with that Prescott Bush and industrialist banker plot to overthrow the government back in the 30s. And Smedley Butler spent the rest of his life trying to convince people that war is a racket. So there are heroes amongst us. There are heroes in our government, but so often they're the ones covered up. This whole official story here reminds me of the Warren Commission. and John J. McCloy, I think if memory serves, he was a member or head of the World Bank, and he was on the Warren Commission, and then the 9/11 Commission, where they tried to front load the thing with Henry Kissinger, a war criminal. The fix is always in, but the good news is, James, because of people like you, because of the internet, because of what happened on 9/11 and so many people waking up to false flag terror and starting to understand what false flag terror is, people truly are waking up. So thank you. We don't have to stop here, but thank you so much for sharing this history with us. Much of it I didn't know. I didn't really know about this cover-up.
One more aspect of the cover-up that I should just mention is that people who cooperated with the cover-up were richly rewarded. For example, Admiral Stanley, who served on the Roberts Commission, 1 month after he signed the commission's findings, he was given an ambassadorship. He was made ambassador to the Soviet Union. Retired Admiral Joseph Reeves, even though he was retired, he was promoted from Rear Admiral to Full Admiral by Roosevelt for distinguished service during the Spanish-American War. Hey, that was 44 years earlier. Okay. Colonel McNarney, who served on the Roberts Commission, was promoted to Brigadier General, then Major General, then Lieutenant General, then Full General, is made commander of all U.S. occupation forces in Germany after the war. General Marshall, who I have not had time to go into, his famous 2-hour horseback ride, his officers were begging him to warn Pearl Harbor. He went off on a 2-hour alleged horseback ride. He was actually meeting with the Soviet ambassador that morning, as we now know from the biography of the Soviet ambassador. But he was made America's first 5-star general. No such designation had ever existed before. And Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, he's given a Nobel Peace Prize for 1945. They hand those things out to anybody who serves their interests. So anybody who cooperated, I've got to mention this. Remember I mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Clausen, who overturned the Army Pearl Harbor Board by getting witnesses to change their testimony. He was made Sovereign Grand Commander of the Scottish Rite in the Southern Jurisdiction, which is the same position Albert Pike held. In other words, he was made the leader of all Freemasons in America after having protected his fellow Freemasons, George Marshall and Franklin D. Roosevelt. So you see how the game works. By the way, anybody who did not cooperate, such as Captain Safford, they stayed captains. They did not get promoted. They did not get rewarded. And that's how realpolitik works in these scenarios. But Sean, I think that I want to close off by emphasizing what you were already talking about. That this is part of a continuum. People like Captain Safford and Admiral Kimmel and Rear Admiral Theobald, who tried to tell the truth about Pearl Harbor, you know what they would say to them? People would say to them, Sean? He would say, our government would never do that to us. It's exactly what 9/11 truthers hear. Our government would never do that to us. But you know what? Our government has been doing that to us with the sinking of the Maine, when the Assistant Secretary of the Navy was Teddy Roosevelt's with Teddy Roosevelt, who was Franklin D. Roosevelt's cousin. Okay, sinking of the Lusitania, World War I. The Maine, of course, the Spanish-American War. The Tonkin Gulf, we were mentioning Vietnam. The attack on the USS Liberty, which is intended to get us into the Six-Day War, it failed. Attack on the La Belle Discotheque, which resulted in Reagan bombing Libya. Incubator babies, weapons of mass destruction, sarin gas attacks. Time after time, we've been deceived into war. So I think it's very important for people to know that there is a continuum, that 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, they do not stand alone, but they're part of a pattern of deception that has been used to advance this agenda, this globalist, communist, Zionist agenda. And by the way, in my book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, which we've talked about on your show, I actually begin with Pearl Harbor. The first chapter is all about false flags that have brought us into wars, and it's a primer on the New World Order. I talk about everything from the Council on Foreign Relations and the Fed to vaccines and weather control. And Sean, as you know, I've had an interesting time with Amazon suppressing this book. It was actually suspended on Kindle. I've now got it reinstated, but they raised the price of the paperback by more than $4 overnight. It's not. They only let it be sold now at a full cover price to make it as inaccessible as possible. But you know all about that, Sean, because you've had your videos demonetized and flagged, as you've been mentioning earlier. The battle is on for the truth.
Yeah, the battle's been on for truth for decades and decades. Unfortunately, people are waking up. The good news is I think people can get the book directly from your website, can't they? JamesPerloff.com.
Oh, they can buy it on Amazon still. It's just at a higher price, and I did have it reinstated on Kindle, so they can buy it there on Amazon.
The downside there is that you're not getting the extra $4. This is just Amazon trying to circumvent people from purchasing the book by charging a higher price, right?
Right. I don't get any extra money for that higher price. That's true. But it also saves me that having to individually package each sale. So I don't mind them selling it. But they have certainly attempted to suppress the sales of the book. But this is something that people ever since Hillary Clinton lost the election and alternative media trumped the mainstream media, the attack has been on so-called fake news ever since. And so we're feeling the brunt of that. But it's actually a testament to our success that they're trying to suppress us, Sean.
Yeah, well, it's a great book, so you guys should definitely head over to Amazon and check out the James Perloff books. James, I think that one of the lessons I've learned, have you ever seen that chart that so many of the presidents throughout history have been related, that they're all like cousins, 10th removed? Yeah. Well, while we were having this conversation, I just wanted to see if good old Franklin D. Roosevelt was related to anybody, and according to famouskin.com, he is the 10th cousin once removed of Queen Elizabeth II. There you go. Isn't that interesting? It just seems like the fix is in and has been for a very, very long time in this country, James.
Yeah, he was also a cousin of Winston Churchill, I should mention. These were the two heads of state, again, that were looking for a way to provoke a situation that would bring us into the Second World War. So, yeah, there is blood ties as well as ideological ties between these people.
Yeah, there sure is. All right, well, as we round out the conversation, if you guys want to learn more, if you want to read this in detail, do head over to jamesperloff.com because, James, you have penned an article about what we've just discussed here, which I think is called Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt's 9/11.
Mm-hmm. And that is footnoted and has links and embeds the BBC video on Pearl Harbor. And you can read. We've only gone. I've done shows on Pearl Harbor that went for 2 hours. We've only given a very condensed version here, but you will get. If you're interested in more elaborate details, it is in my article on my website, jamesperloff.com.
Yeah, we've just scratched the surface here, but we wanted to do this broadcast just to try to shine some light on the truth of what really happened on December 7th, a day that will live in infamy. Pearl Harbor was a lee hop. Let it happen on purpose.
Mm-hmm. Make it happen and let it happen.
All right. Well, James, thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it very much. Guys, head over to jamesperloff.com to learn more and stay up to speed on all of the latest articles coming from James. And do check out his books on Amazon. James, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Sean. Congratulations. I think you've got almost 250,000 subscribers now, despite the attempts to suppress your work. So congratulations on continuing to bring more people to a knowledge of the truth.
Oh, thanks, James. Yeah, and thanks to all of my subscribers. And guys, if you've been unsubscribed, sometimes that happens, believe me, please resubscribe and click the little bell. That'll keep you updated on all the latest updates. Whenever I post a video, it will come up in your feed that way. So yeah, thanks, James. Thanks for that call out. And guys, thanks so much to all of you for tuning in. We very much appreciate it. Do spread this information within your own sphere of influence on social media. Share the link. And thanks for visiting us at sgtreport.com for real news, the antidote to corporate propaganda and lies 24/7. Thanks, guys. God bless.
Horrible, terrible story that John Podesta and I were running a child trafficking ring in the basement of a pizzeria